with Mahler's music. Did you all hear that?
Yeah.
So you're on. Mona from the QA office has asked me to record this call. If we manage to say anything intelligent, she might try and clip it together and post it on social media. So here you go.
Not much hope of that then.
Good luck.
If I haven't said already, could you please keep your microphones on mute unless you have something really intelligent to say as a part of, we'll do a bit of a Q&A at the end of this chat. So maybe you could actually send me a message during the chat if you have a question, and then I'll throw it to you, and you can ask Paul and Trish or myself your question. My first question is to Trish and Paul. Like, what was your first encounter with Mahler's music, as maybe as a young person, as a teenager, as a kid, as a young musician?
Well, it would have been with the Sydney Symphony. In fact, I think it may have been Mahler too, with Stuart Challender conducting. Stuart Challender, for anyone who doesn't know who he is, you should go and look him up. He was possibly the greatest Australian conductor that we would ever have. He unfortunately died of AIDS in 1991. But he was the most passionate, incredible conductor. So I think his love for and his incredible knowledge of Mahler's music was infectious. So, you know, just the feeling of sitting in the middle of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, in the middle of the Sydney Opera House, having this, he was an enormous man, like really huge, and he used to wave his arms around really, you know, all his gestures were really big, and he kind of almost grabbed the orchestra and brought them to him and made him do what he wanted them to do there was no ego, there was no pushing down or anything like that. It was purely, I am intensely passionate about this music, come and see what I see. And I think that was possibly the best introduction to Mahler I could possibly have. So, right. And yes, it was Mahler too.
That's amazing.
Paul? I grew up in this house, as sad as that sounds.
You have left. You did leave and come back.
I did leave for quite a few decades, actually, it turns out. But I had two older brothers. Brett was 5 years older than me, and Craig was 7 years older than me. And of course, they were in QA01, as it was known in those days. And I guess my first experience of actually hearing Mahler live was with the Queensland Youth Orchestra with John Currow at Main Hall doing the first Mahler Symphony. And it wasn't exactly my first experience of Mahler, because my two brothers had this ongoing argument that lasted, I think, for 5 or 6 years, from when I was about 12 or 13, about who was better, Bruckner or Mahler. And my elder brother loved Bruckner, and my middle brother loved Mahler. And so I couldn't avoid it. You know, I didn't want to come in and say, I guess at one point I said, I think Shostakovich is better than both of them. But I think, you know, I was swamped with Mahler from an extremely early age. And sorry,
I just have to say that's quite funny, because we often have a conversation about which is the better Ninth Symphony, Bruckner or Mahler, and I'm Mahler and he's Bruckner.
The debate is ongoing. And do you have any?
Not to say I don't think Mahler 9 is amazing. I just think Bruckner 9 is double amazing. But
I mean, amongst those vinyl LPs that you've got there behind you, are there any Mahler recordings amongst those that you would have listened to as a kid?
Yeah.
And actually, I think I could probably just run and grab my Mahler 5 with Carry On and the Berlin Philharmonic, you know, with the rainbow, which you would have grown up with too, Simon. That was, I think that record, I mean, I haven't played it, that particular version, in years, because I just don't think it'll work. I played it so much when I was about 17. I was tortured by the Adagietto when I was 16 or 17. Tortured in two ways. One, I was a clarinettist and I would never play in that movement. And two, it's the most heartbreaking thing I think I'd heard at that age.
I have a bit of a confession to make. I, as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old, as I started getting more and more obsessed with the clarinet, and I was discovering Mozart and Brahms, my first kind of obsessions as a teenager were definitely focused around that clarinet repertoire. And then I quickly got into Beethoven. And so I sort of was pretty well steeped in that kind of Austro-Germanic repertoire by the time I was 15 or 16. I spent a lot of time listening to Mozart, to Beethoven, to Schumann, Schubert, Brahms, Mendelssohn, Bruckner as well. That the first time I heard Mahler, I didn't quite get it. You know, it just seemed so sort of spiky, and it didn't have that homogeneous kind of round beauty of, say, of Wagner's orchestration or Brahms. It always seemed to be doing multiple things at once, shooting off in different directions. And I definitely needed a few listenings to, I think it was the Second Symphony and the Third Symphony, I think, was the one I first really got into big time. The last movement of the Third Symphony is just one of the great slow movements ever written. And it was probably, yeah, it took me a year or two of listening to the symphonies to really sort of realize how extraordinary they were. I mean, was that something that you, or did you get it straight away?
Actually, I was thinking about this. The complexity of Mahler's work is what makes it so wonderful. It feels as though it's simple in some ways. You get these beautiful, simple tunes all the way through, but it's mixed in. It's kind of like a cookie dough that's got too many parts to it sometimes, and you can't quite work out what it is. But it also makes it every instrument player's favorite piece. They always think, like, everyone in a Bruckner symphony, I guess if you play a Bruckner symphony, the brass think that it's just the best music ever because it features the brass, and if you play a Mozart symphony, it's probably the clarinets or the violins. With a Mahler, everybody thinks that they have the best line because
Yeah.
they do, because it's all in there, and it's all kind of interwoven. It's kind of like a water going down a stream, you know, with lots of rocks and shapes, and there's the light, and there's just so many different elements that make it one big river.
That's a beautiful way of thinking about it. Like I think for me it seemed quite kaleidoscopic, and I guess that's because it is. You know, you've got military band music, you've got music from the local pub, you know, klezmer Jewish clarinet music. You've got you know, these church-like chorales. You have brass band music. You have these beautiful romantic string passages, all sort of woven together. And it took me a while to sort of understand that that's exactly what Mahler wanted to do. He wanted to take the whole oral universe that he lived in and sort of fold it together.
Yeah,
I know it's and it's funny you should say that Germanic sound of Brahms and Bruckner and Wagner. I think the thing that really attracted me as a clarinettist to Mahler was that you just had all of these bizarre, interesting things to play, and you know, just playing. I mean, I know the cuckoo for the clarinet has been used throughout time from Beethoven's Sixth, the Carnival of the Animals, but Mahler one. The first thing that really grabbed me was the fact that the clarinet got to play this cuckoo all through the first movement, and he kept on changing the interval and changing major, minor, and I just found that unbelievably satisfying as a listener to all of these different colors. And you know, he really did bridge that end of the romantic period into modernism and, you know, Stravinsky. And I guess I was fortunate that the Rite of Spring was already a part of my sort of daily or weekly diet of listening, thanks to my brothers. So the sort of seemingly abrupt atonality of Mahler never really affected me in the way that somebody just coming from Mozart and Brahms may have found it a little bit odd.
It's funny though, having learned a lot about Mahler, I think it also affected how I listened to Mozart and Brahms, because having heard Mahler, I realized that, well, Brahms and Mozart weren't as homogenous as I thought they were either. You know, with Brahms, you have all those Hungarian influences. You also have cafe music and Viennese popular music threaded through a lot of Brahms music. And of course, with Mozart, you have all sorts of exotic influences, whether it's Italian influences, Turkish influences. And so sometimes these cliched images you have of a composer being just one thing, you realize that they're all actually taking multiple influences. I wanted to ask Paul, actually, as a composer, like, you know, what lessons do you learn from encountering Mahler as a composer, and how does that affect how you write for the orchestra?
Oh, it's an enormous influence on me, I have to say, and the thing that always amazes me about Mahler is the spinning out of the material, and how he can, if you take the slow movement of the fourth Symphony, which I think is probably my favorite movement of Mahler. Just Trish was talking about that simplicity and how he can take the simplicity of that opening, glorious opening cello tune in the Fourth Symphony and turn it into something within 20 minutes. I mean, we're not talking 5 minutes. He turns this into, well, I think it's 18 minutes. He turns it into something that you can never imagine it turning into from the start. And just that spinning out of the material and the time span, you know. And I think the great thing for young musicians playing Mahler is that, particularly in this day and age where everything sort of happens so quickly, and you know, we click and go, and you know, we don't have to go to a library anymore to find out anything about anyone. We just Google it, and you know, everything sort of happens immediately. I think the great thing about Mahler is this timelessness, and I've never sat through a Mahler symphony, I don't think, even bad performances, and yes, I've heard and played in bad performances. It never feels like it's a long time. It always feels too short for me. You know, Mahler 2 is what, you know, an hour and 20. I don't know how long it is.
Hour and 25. Yeah.
Yeah, and I always feel disappointed when it's over. I just want it to keep going because, and I know that's kind of maybe I'm just a lunatic, but there's something timeless about, well, sitting in an orchestra playing Mahler is a challenge, but it's also timeless.
Yeah.
It's sitting in a great performance. Like if you ever watch those videos of the Lucerne Festival Orchestra with the Bardo, which just, you know, I mean, that's probably the pinnacle of, at this point for me, of performances of Mahler symphonies.
Mm.
You could, you know, day could turn into night and you wouldn't notice. It's just, it grabs you. Every ounce of your oral perception is grabbed by something at all times. And as a composer, that feeling that you can spin material out, but it never gets boring, and it becomes more interesting the longer it goes. I mean, if I could ever write, you know, 18 minutes of music that will use that little amount of material and also kept the audience basically by the throat for the whole time, you know, I would think that I've achieved something. I haven't yet, by the way. I'll just point that out.
Yes,
Your first symphony is pretty good. If you guys haven't heard Paul's first symphony, which was premiered by the Australian World Orchestra on the 3rd of June, I had the good fortune to be at that performance. And boy, that is a fantastic orchestra, and it's a really fantastic symphony. So if a recording exists, I hope we can make it available to the QAO musicians to have a listen at some stage.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy for you to share that with them, Simon. I think it's been played on the radio now, so essentially I think it belongs to me. Although that area of copyright has always been a bit grey for me. Yeah. But I mean, they're very nice words, but there's still, you know, I listen to it in reflection and then get confronted by something like Mahler 4 or Bruckner 7, and I think, you know, there's something about that Germanic tradition that
you just need little round glasses. That's all.
Oh, is that all?
Yeah.
Gee, that's easy. Oh, okay, it's done.
Yeah.
My second symphony is going to be just unbelievable. In fact, I'm going to call it the unbelievable.
The unbelievable. I can't wait. Well, Trish, I wanted to ask you, you know, the difference between sitting in an orchestra, being a part of a Mahler symphony and listening to it. Is there a big difference for you?
Yeah, look, it's a very difficult one in some ways, because I was in the Sydney Symphony for 12 years, and I did get to play all of the Mahler symphonies, and I took them for granted, I'm afraid. I feel really bad. I feel as though I was in a chocolate box of music. I had the best conductors, the best players, the best symphonies, and playing a Mahler symphony was an everyday event for me. And then I injured myself, and I injured my wrist on a tour, and I had to stop playing. And it was then that I really, really understood what it was like to play a Mahler symphony, because all I could do was listen. For 6 years, I couldn't play.
Wow.
And, yeah, it was actually then that I realized what I missed in orchestral playing, and what was important and what wasn't. And I think the Mahler symphonies definitely stood out as they were definitely the most incredible things. But I've always been the kind of person that I can't listen to something without saying, let's play it. So that's why you get phone calls at 11 o'clock at night or texts saying, let's do Bruckner or let's do Mahler or something like that, because we're listening to something and just going, we've got to play this. So for me as a musician, listening to it, I'm sitting there singing along the cello line or the viola line or something, and finding something different every time, and and absolutely love it. But I do prefer to play them. Having said that, I do have this really. I had an experience with Mahler when I wasn't playing, and I was working with somebody who was a rock drummer. He knew nothing about classical music whatsoever, and I was running a conservatorium at that time, and I was kind of retreating into my headphones, and when everything got too noisy and there were too many students around, and I just needed to get some work done. So I put on Mahler 2, the last movement of Mahler 2, up loud on my headphones. And he walked in, and he was kind of the business manager, and he walked in and he said, what are you listening to? And I said, just a second, have a listen to this. And I put the headphones on him. Now, this is a guy who knew nothing about classical music, had never listened to it before. Like, pretty straight down the line. He used to be a real estate agent, that kind of thing. He burst into tears when he heard it. And that, to me, made me realize how powerful Mahler is at all levels. You don't have to know what music is like to hear it. You don't have to be a musician to hear it. You can be anyone, and it can actually really affect you at an incredibly deep level. And that's where that simplicity comes through, isn't it? It's the simplicity with the complexity that adds the emotion that can touch everybody. And I think that's why it's so popular as well.
Sorry, Paul.
That's the difference between a Bruckner symphony and a Mahler symphony, is that because the Mahler is based on folk peasant music, and of course all of the other layers as well, I think it has a greater appeal. And I mean, it's really only has been since the 1960s that Mahler became really super popular. Because it was the one way to sort of guarantee that you wouldn't have an audience in the pre and post-war years, was to put Mahler symphonies on. They would turn away in their droves, but
maybe that was the recording, though, that people could listen to it.
Yeah, maybe it's the recording industry that enabled us to get to know them. I don't know.
I think as Paul's onto something, though, because I know that during his lifetime there are very few performances of his symphonies that were successful. The second symphony was a big success for him, as was the third, but the Vienna Philharmonic didn't want to play his works. They considered him a conductor first and foremost and a composer second. And I think that sense of him wanting to incorporate every type of musical style, a lot of them thought it was a little bit cheap, this kind of kaleidoscopic thing where he would have music from the local tavern, intersecting with the folk music, the shepherd's music, the countryside music of Austria, and then you'd have these big kind of hymn-like chorales superimposed on all of that. I think there was this sort of bias towards it, that it wasn't elevated enough. But I think now we sort of see there's that universalism where Mahler wanted to embrace everyone and everything. And in preparing for our rehearsals with QAS, Mahler's Second Symphony, Mahler's picture of the Last Judgment, in the last movement of the Second Symphony, he doesn't condemn anybody to hell. He doesn't really judge anybody. It's a vision where everybody gets risen up, to everlasting life. And so I kind of love that about him. He's just so universal. He wants, what did he say? A symphony should embrace the world. It should.
Yeah. Don't you wish you were at that conversation between him and Sibelius? When they were talking about the meaning of the symphony in 1908 or 1909 or whenever it was, just before he died, suddenly, of course. But, if you were going to be at any moment in history, that, for me, that would have been the one conversation I would have loved to have been a part of.
Pretty interesting conversation.
Well, Sibelius was all about how do we spin the material out? How do we take these cells? And, and he'd had this big success, of course, with the second symphony at that point. And it was all about, using the material until there was nothing left, no blood left in it. And Mahler just dismissed him and basically said, "Hey, come on, the symphony is the world. It has to have everything in it. You know, forget all of this little stuff and developing this little stuff. It has to have literally encompass everything.
Mm.
I think the really interesting thing that I've been thinking about recently with Mahler is that he was the last of the Germanic symphonists. And it was almost like the pinnacle of the symphony as far as German and Austrian composers were concerned. I'm sure people will argue with that point, but the symphony was then taken over, obviously, by the Scandinavians and the Russians and to a lesser extent the Americans. And maybe the fact that he just changed it beyond the Germanic tradition was part of the reason for that. I'm yet to come up with a definitive answer for that one.
Yeah, I'd like to get on to talking about the symphony and playing symphonies in more general terms. Before we do, I just got two more questions that sort of relate a little bit to Mahler. One is about Mahler's great contemporary Richard Strauss. They were born at a similar time. Mahler was born 1860. Strauss, I think, was born 1864. Strauss, of course, lived a lot longer than Mahler. He was far more successful as a composer during his lifetime than Mahler was. Mahler said something interesting about Strauss. He said, "Strauss and I tunnel from opposite sides of the mountain. One day we will meet." Mm-hmm. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, that's a really tough question.
Yeah.
I think it's probably because Strauss's music, I mean, until 1906, Strauss was the contemporary composer. I mean, he was leading the world in breaking new boundaries. And once Salome had been premiered in 1906, he did this massive retreat back into late Romantic harmony. And you know, Rosenkavalier was a beautiful, fantastic piece, but it was a huge step backwards. So Strauss was along this path of, we're going to make everything new, we're going to make everything new. And then all of a sudden was, I don't really like this new. And so he did this massive U-turn. And I think what he's trying, I mean, reading the letters of Strauss and Mahler and just looking at the development of both of their careers. And it's interesting that Strauss regarded himself as a B-grade composer. And he loved Mahler, and I think his love of Mahler was blossomed much more once Mahler had passed away. But Strauss was much more in that sort of Brucknerian, Wagnerian, Brahmsian even orchestral sound. And I think I mean, of course, the E-flat clarinet writing and all of the percussion is not in that Brahmsian sound, but it was still based in incredible tradition of orchestral sound, whereas Mahler was, you know, completely the other pole. He was looking for new sounds all the time, the C clarinets, the incredible things that he did with the percussion, the Mahler sixth, the death knell from the hammer strike, and all of those things. Mahler was always looking forward, I think, and I think he realized that Strauss was looking back.
I think Strauss is also more of a painter in music. He paints pictures and creates images more with his writing. Like the Alpine Symphony, you can see the cows and the hills and the bells and the storm, you can feel them, and you know, all of the tone poems and things like that. Whereas Mahler didn't tend to do that. He didn't describe scenes. He created more of a sound world and used melody.
Strauss often seems to me like an IMAX film. You know, it's so clear what he's describing. You don't need the visuals. You know, you can actually.
No.
He famously said, "I can orchestrate." You know, my wife and son and I having breakfast together. And
in fact, he did. He did in the Domestic Symphony.
But I got a thought for you guys. I have had this image listening to the scherzo from Mahler's Seventh Symphony, which is one of the scariest and haunting scherzos ever written. I had this image of somebody outside a great Viennese ballroom looking in at the action. And at that time, I realized, what music would they be playing inside the ballroom? They'd be playing Richard Strauss or Johann Strauss. And it seemed to me that Strauss is the ultimate insider. You know, he's born into a prosperous Bavarian family. His father was principal horn in the Bavarian State Opera Orchestra. He had the best type of musical education that you could imagine, a happy home life. You know, he got the perfect start in his career. You know, he was assistant to Hans von Bülow in the Meiningen Orchestra. He played Mozart piano concertos. he was celebrated as a composer by the time he was 22 or 23. Whereas Mahler was the ultimate outsider, you know, growing up in a violent household in Bohemia, having to fight every step of the way, wanting to compose, but not having those early successes, so having to conduct more. And then, of course, being Jewish, you know, in an empire where anti-Semitism was rife. And so I often think of Mahler and Strauss as, you know, you've got your outsider and your insider, and perhaps with similar ideals, but coming from very different backgrounds.
Yeah, there's that beautiful conversation they had the night that the Salome was premiered in Graz in 1906, where they went for the walk in the mountains and they got lost. And Mahler, who was just there to see Salome, actually started really fretting and really worrying. And Strauss was, this talks a lot about the difference between the two. Mahler was completely nervous and worried. And Strauss just said, well, they can't start without me. And I think that really talks volumes about the two characters. One was completely sure of himself, and you can hear it in the orchestration of Strauss. He was totally sure of himself. Yeah. And Mahler, as you said, Mahler spent most of his life being absolutely criticized for being Jewish and dealing with anti-Semitism, like you and I will never understand the pressure and the hatred that he had to put up with.
Yet Strauss saw himself as a B-grade composer.
Yeah, well, that's refreshing, isn't it?
Go figure.
I don't think I mean, apart from maybe the four last songs, there's never a moment in Strauss. I mean, I love Strauss to bits, but there's never a moment that you feel completely transported. Whereas there are so many moments in Mahler where I feel transported. And to me, that's the difference. It's the feeling that I get when I listen to those composers.
Perhaps the lack of struggle, you know, that you don't sense in. I get a similar sense sometimes in Mendelssohn, where this effortless technical facility, where you can sort of sense that they can say anything they want to say, but you don't have that sense like you have with Beethoven or with Mahler of actually having to struggle to say what you mean, and sometimes that makes all the difference.
Yeah, it really. I think Mendelssohn's a perfect example of someone who never had to fight to put, you know, the food on the table, but had this incredible facility. But, you know, there's never a moment in Mendelssohn that gets you like Beethoven.
No. Well, that brings us nicely back to my next question with, you know, I wanted to talk a little bit about the symphony and playing symphonies, because, you know, after all at QAO, especially in the orchestras, playing symphonies is a big part of our repertoire. At QAO2, I think you're working on Dvorak 8 right now. You know, we've been working on Mahler 2, two pieces, you know, perhaps about not that far apart in time when they were composed, maybe 10 or 15 years, but hughtly different. You know, what is a symphony? You know, in the European tradition, in the 20th century, you've just composed a symphony. You know, what was it that made you want to compose a symphony and not 30 minutes of music? You know, what is a symphony?
I don't know. It's 10:30 of a Saturday morning. How do you expect me to answer a question that's
going up on Facebook?
2 p.m. of 2 a.m. of a Sunday morning might be the best time to ask me that question. Look, the symphony to music is the novel of literature. It's the sonnet of poetry. It's the, you know, it is orchestrally, it is the pinnacle. Yeah. And it started, you know, the Symphonia started with this, you know, basically an overture to an opera. And it's thanks to Haydn and Mozart and of course many others around that time, it became the ultimate form of a composer's expression. And that journey through, you know, I guess we really have to thank Beethoven for it the most, because once the Eroica Symphony was the big turning point for the symphony. Yes, we love the last 3 Mozart symphonies, and yes, we love the last 10 Haydn symphonies, but it was the Eroica Symphony that was the game changer for the symphony, because all of a sudden became an expression of absolute emotion over, you know, technical wizardry and precision and all of those things. And one only has to hear those diminished seventh chords that sound like the Rite of Spring in the Eroica to realize that you're in something that's much more important than life itself. A symphony, you know, of course, it's the well, I'm a vegetarian, so I'm not going to say it's the meat in the sandwich, but it's the tofu in the sandwich of a concert, or the falafel. It's what gives an orchestra its sound. It's what gives an orchestra its reason for being. And you know, as much as I love tone poems or overtures or something, you know, if I had to list my top 100 pieces of music, I guarantee that, you know, that 90 of them would be symphonies, because it's just the ultimate form of human expression through music. And to me, preferable to opera, though, I mean, I can't, you know, Marriage of Figaro is probably the greatest achievement of Western art music, never to be surpassed. But having said that, to me, the symphony is much more, because in a sense you get to you make up your own story of what the story isn't dictated to you. The story is what you make of it. And you know, it's been wonderful doing Dvorak 8 with QAO2, because they've really grasped that sense of groundedness in the music. They've really grasped that sort of really incredibly serious, this is a statement feel to it. And to have written a symphony now, writing a symphony was like having a massive monkey on my back, or a big chip on my shoulder, or both shoulders, because for a composer to write a symphony, it's you're immediately opening yourself up to comparisons with the greats. I found it much more imposing writing a symphony than writing an opera, because in a sense, you know, the story was there, the libretto was there. I just followed the story, and I didn't sort of think, oh, well, this isn't Marriage of Figaro, is it? I never sort of thought that. But when I was writing the symphony, it was like, well, you know, Bruckner wouldn't have done this. How would Brahms have dealt with this? What does form have to do with it? Does it have to be in sonata form? What are the relationships between the notes? All of those things would keep me awake all night. Yes, I'm a very boring person. Just ask my wife.
We did actually have a lot of conversations about the form, though, of a symphony, because technically a symphony, or traditionally the symphony, has been what, 4 movements, sometimes 3 movements, and a 1 movement symphony ends up being a tone poem or a single piece. In modern music, it seems to have changed. You know, not many people write symphonies anymore, mostly because they don't believe they'll be played, I think. But there are so many pieces written for symphony orchestra that are not symphonies, and they're not even pretending to be, and they don't follow that format. But then how do you stay with the 4 movement format and still produce something new, still stay within a modern context, and be up to date, and not be told that you're antiquarian in your attitude towards writing? So it was a very big topic of conversation, wasn't it? And it was a big decision of yours to actually go with the 4 movement format.
It was. We did. I mean, we both talked about a storyboard, and in many ways it started. I mean, we were still in lockdown when I started it, so I mean, you know, it wasn't exactly the most cheerful thing watching ABC 24/7. But also we just come out of the bushfires, so in a sense there was a rationale for writing an Australian symphony at that time, as far as I was concerned. Whether I was the person to do it or not, I was writing the symphony, and it was very much born out of that summer of bushfires, which sort of changed everything. And then no sooner had we got out of that, but we were in lockdown. You know, we couldn't see our friends, and we couldn't. So there was a lot of emotion boiling inside me, as there was in everyone. So that enabled me to find the narrative myself in the symphony, and it enabled me to have the sort of need to express, I guess. So from that perspective, I guess I was sort of lucky that I had a narrative to follow. And I think that those words of Mahler, and you and I, Simon, were talking a lot during that time, that time of when I was writing it. And we often talked about that whole thing of Mahler saying, well, it has to encompass everything. But then is that the same for everyone? I don't know, and I don't think so. But for me, that those words were a great help and a great hindrance at the same time. And you probably heard my first version of my first movement, when I literally did put the whole world in it, and I threw, the kitchen sink and all the wooden spoons and the pastry brushes were in there. And when I came back to that 12-minute monolith of nothingness, which was the first movement of my symphony, and I completely rewrote it. Mahler was very much at the forefront of my mind, that idea of clarity. That doesn't really answer your question. I'm sorry. What
is a symphony?
What is a symphony? A symphony is a 4-movement piece for a symphony orchestra that lasts about 40 minutes, unless you're Mahler, and in that case, it lasts an hour and a half. There you go. That's what a symphony is.
For me, a symphony is a composer saying, I've got something that I want you all to listen to. Because if you think about it, until Mozart and Haydn started writing symphonies, a lot of instrumental music for ensembles was literally that, incidental music. It was played while other things were going on, whether it was Tafelmusik or even an overture to an opera. They wouldn't dim the lights. People would keep talking. Back in those days, people sat in their boxes, they'd have meals, they'd play cards. And the opera was sort of going on in the background, but it wasn't the way we think of going to an opera now, where you sort of sit in darkness and watch the opera without distraction. It was only Wagner who introduced all of that. And so I think this idea that a composer creates a work of substance for public performance and people will sit still and listen to it and not do anything else. It's sort of a statement of intent, a composer saying, I've got something to say. And I think you certainly did that with your symphony. I wanted to just, because you guys have so much experience as performing musicians, you've been soloists, you're chamber musicians, you've been orchestral musicians as well. What skills do you have to bring to playing in an orchestra that are different to, say, playing as a soloist or playing as a chamber musician? Or do you use the same set of skills but just in a different way? Trish, you've done all three of those things.
Yeah, look, I think it's very different. For the answer to that question will be very different for both of us, because, well, here you can answer yours. As a string player, in an orchestra, it's incredibly important, and I think this is something that comes down to auditions, kids. This is your big key with auditions, is that you need to be able to play with 9 other cellos, for example. You need to be able to play strongly, exactly, but not stick out. And that's a really major part. You have to be able to feel the emotion, but not sort of stand out and say, here am I. You've got to play precisely at all times. But you can't be a machine either. So it's quite an exacting thing to be part of a section, to become part of the cog in the wheel, and to hear everything else that's going on at the same time, and be, either right underneath a conductor or at the opposite end of the orchestra, and still be listening, but still be following a conductor. It's very much, it's more of a passive role, I guess, being in an orchestra. And I think in a string section, sorry. And I think I mean, orchestral musicians become quite lazy as well. They don't know how to move their own music stands or chairs. They've got someone to do it for them. And it's a huge shock when you get someone who hasn't been out of the orchestra for a while to come and play chamber music, because they look at you and they kind of expect the stand to be set up for them, and the music to be on their stands, and everything to just be perfect for them. And you just go, there's no librarian here, darling. So moving into chamber music, you have the same need to listen, most definitely. And if you can play orchestral music in the way you play chamber music, but without sticking out, it's great. But when you play chamber music, it's just, you have to play more like a soloist without being the only one that stands out. So you have to have that level of communication. So you're instead of having a conversation with 100 people, you're having a conversation with 4 to 6 people in chamber music, and you need to have a stronger voice, you need to be heard, but you need to allow everybody else to come out. So it is much more soloistic playing without saying, here I am, this is all about me. And then, of course, as a soloist, it's just go for it. But then you've got to, I mean, if you're playing a concerto with orchestra, you've also got to listen to an orchestra and realize that they're not going to come with you just because you feel like it, which is what you have in chamber music. In chamber music, there's that lovely fluidity where you think, oh, I think I might do this today. And because you're playing with wonderful chamber musicians, they go, oh, yeah, let's do that. They're doing something interesting. Let's follow them. And it becomes fluid and lovely. When you're a soloist, you think, oh, I might do. No, I won't. They won't let me. Okay, I'll just do that. And you can't move. You can't sort of take risks unless you're playing a cadenza. You just can't. So you have to, and then you've got to hit the back of the hall, and it's got to be very present. So there's three totally different ways of playing in those things. But I think each of them has their absolute benefits. I think that playing in an orchestra can be just as satisfying, probably more satisfying than being a soloist, because being a soloist is a kind of a harrowing, lonely life, and playing chamber music is the best.
I sort of think of it, if we think of it in Olympic terms, yes, we have watched a lot of Olympics this week. Playing in an orchestra is a bit like that incredible game of hockey between Belgium and Australia the other night.
Yeah.
The teamwork amongst, well, both teams were incredible. And the precision and the brilliance of each individual was only important when they were part of the team, when they aided the team. Nobody's individual brilliance was outstanding unless it was aiding and abetting their teammates or helping their teammates or being the recipient of help from their teammates. Whereas if you watch Djokovic play tennis, that's being a soloist. He worries about everything on the court. It's all about him.
And he destroys his racket from time to time.
Yeah, and he's almost as badly behaved as some of the soloists that I've met in my life too. Yeah, and then you look at the doubles in table tennis, and that's a little bit more like chamber music. The brilliance, more so than doubles in tennis. I don't even see that as a team effort really. But doubles in, if any of you saw the doubles in the table tennis, that is perfect chamber music. You know, the giving, the taking, the dominating, the sitting back, the helping, the just the overall sense and knowledge of what everyone else was doing that's pure chamber music. So just from sporting terms, you know, and if you watch the great English Premier League teams like Liverpool, Man U, or my beloved West Ham, that's a great orchestra, you know, because they're so, I mean, forget Lionel Messi and all of the outstanding stars. They're more the Djokovic's and the soloists. But you know, a great defense is in soccer is a great string section. You know, everything is for everyone else. Everything is for the team. Everyone is for the result of what you're working towards. And I really see that, you know, and I think we work really like that in a sense in QAO too, that this sense that, you know, everyone has to play as good as they can, but for the better of everyone else in the orchestra. And, you know, I think, you know, I often think that the back desks of the strings are much more important than the front desks because it's much harder for them being down the back in that distance. And so, you know, they're the back line. They're the fullbacks that are keeping the goals out. So, you know, I really see it in those terms. Being a wind player in an orchestra is really quite complicated. It's a bit more being like a chamber musician. It differs if you're playing Dvorak. Being a clarinettist, you're part of the texture for most of the time, and then 3 times in the symphony, you'll all of a sudden the spotlight will be on you. But you have to understand how your role works within the wind section, and then what's the role of the wind section within the overall sound of the orchestra. In Mahler, it's completely different because, you know, in a sense, Mahler uses the wind section to obliterate the sound sometimes, or to completely, you know, to be the peasant band, or to be the Jewish klezmer band, or all those things. So it all takes great understanding of what your role is. And I think, and I'm not sure Trish will agree with me, but I think playing in an orchestra as a tutti or a solo musician is is much more complicated than chamber music, primarily because it's about knowing what your role is. You know, those great soccer teams or the great AFL teams, you know, each player has their particular role and they know what that role is, and their object in the game is to go out and do that role. And I think that the same can be said for most members of a symphony orchestra. They have to understand their role, be able to play their part, train to be able to play their parts, and the most importantly, understand what the role is, you know, for the violin 2 number 12, as opposed to clarinet number 2 or bassoon, contrabassoon or third trombone. Everyone has an equally important role. You've just got to understand it.
Actually, I have to edit my comment as well about when I said that orchestral players need to be, or string players need to be more passive. That's the wrong term. I think you need to be more agreeable as a player. Playing in the Australian World Orchestra was probably the highlight for me of playing in an orchestra, because every single string player was a brilliant player from front to back. It didn't matter who was leading. It actually really didn't matter who led the sections. It was everybody could play at the same level, and so it was just this enormous sound that had to be harnessed and brought back. Whereas some orchestras tend to be, they're really good at the front, and then they kind of get worse as they get towards the back, and that's actually passive. That's not as good. The excitement of being in an orchestra where the violinists, you know, in the back desk of the seconds are playing just as well and just as committed as the people in the front desk of the first is quite palpable, and it makes an enormous difference. And that's what you see in the great European orchestras, that they're all playing. They can all play their instruments. If you look at Lucerne Festival Orchestra under Abado, they're all incredible players who have been brought together to play in this amazing sort of organism called an orchestra. And I think that's really important to remember, that you need to do that. But I think what has to go in that scenario is ego. That's where you can't stick out like a barnacle, and you can't be claiming any kind of betterness. Is that a word?
It'll do.
I just made up a word. Than any other musician. You have to still form part of that organism. So, you know, it's like bones in a body. You can't be more important than one, because you'll fall over. So it's very much being part of the team. But I think I would definitely encourage everyone in the back playing just as well as the ones in the front.
Actually better.
Yeah.
Stronger and better, and your role is much more important.
I think those are really amazing insights. I talk to the QAS musicians a lot about situational awareness and just being alert. So playing your part is only the start of it. You know, you need to obviously play your part beautifully, but you need to be so alert to what's going on around you and have that you know, head above the parapet. So you're really, as you were saying, Paul, you're conscious of what's going on elsewhere in the orchestra, and you're reacting to what the conductor's doing, to what your section leaders are doing. But if everybody's doing that, the whole thing just is so alive. But if you've only got a few people doing that, you do have this sort of drag on, and then you do get that sense that there's this inertia that things can't move, and you can't spontaneously adjust.
Yeah, I think, sorry, one of the really, I say this to the conservatorium students a lot, is particularly in chamber music, but I think doubly so in orchestra. You practice your parts for a couple of reasons. You go to the first rehearsal knowing what your part is, so that you can technically play it. And I used to go to QAS or QA01 with my parts known, so you know, Mr. Caro didn't yell at me, or I wasn't embarrassed by how badly I played. But actually the most important thing about that first rehearsal is understanding where you fit and how your part is, what an important part of the jigsaw your particular part is. Now, you can't do that if you're scrambling for notes. It's really important that you, in a concert, you play your part, but your entire self is worrying about what everyone else is doing. And you know your part so well that you don't have to worry about your part. You're just worrying about how it reacts to all of the other parts. It's like this incredible inner game of an electricity shooting everywhere. And that's what makes the great orchestras great. I mean, you only have to look at the Simon Bolivar Youth Orchestra. not all of them are amazing technicians on their instrument, but the electricity between all of them and the desire to make the whole fantastic is far outweighs the needs of the one or the two. Sorry.
No, also in string sections, I think it's also important to, and especially with youth orchestras, a lot of youth or most youth orchestras, I think, don't worry as much about bowings, for example, as I do. I go into an orchestra and I see a youth orchestra and they're all doing different bowings along the desks, and I have a quiet freak out because to me, you've got to be playing the same bowing as the people on the front desk. You have to be. And if you're not, you should be completely paranoid about it. It is actually a big worry. So I think it indicates your level of connectedness to other people and to what's happening outside your own instrument. So it's not just between you and your conductor, it's between you and the rest of the section. So if you're not constantly aware of what bowing the front desks are doing, or the fact that you might not be doing the same bowing, then you need to switch on, because it's incredibly important that you're all doing the same thing, that you're all in the same part of the bow, that you're using the same bow speed, but particularly down to basics, that you're actually on the right, whether it's a down or an up bow. That should actually be one of your main concerns. And I think spoon feeding with pre-bowed parts is fun, but I think it actually teaches you more to have to look around and say, hang on a second, am I doing the same as those people in front of me? If not, change it and allow other people to change it after you, and then you're being part of the team.
As a part of that situational awareness. And the same is true of the oboe section or the trombone section or the horn section, that people are actually listening to each other, playing with the same articulation, the same weight of sound, the same direction of phrasing, and that you've got that awareness within your section that you actually want to be. It's that magical mixture of homogeneity and hetero, the opposite one, you know, where an orchestra needs to be a collection of individuals who are so immersed in what they're doing that they're actually blending, conforming, but then on occasion really poking their noses out and being fabulously individualistic, and then folding themselves back into the collective again. Guys,
that's a real skill, to know when it is your moment and when you have to stand back.
Yep.
And when to support someone, when you need to be supported. They're the skills that I learned when I was in QAO, and I've continued obviously to learn them through my time in the QSO and through Ensemble Q and Southern Cross and all of those groups I played with. But I really started to learn those things when I was in QAO 3 probably.
I wanted to keep this session to an hour, but we've got a few questions that people have sent through. So we'll go over an hour if that's okay with everyone. I've got a question from Isabel Watson. I think this one's for me. She writes, because of the gigantic proportions, saturation of melodic content and other influences, what do you think about how you can make the formal structure evident when you conduct Mahler, or do you embrace the gradual spinning out of material? Thanks, Isabel. Conducting Mahler is a huge challenge. I think a lot about the proportions of tempo to each other, because, you know, constructed these massive movements, you know, the first movement of Mahler 2, it's 20 something minutes. The last movement is half an hour long. I think you need to sort of think a lot about pacing, and pacing is both the relations of tempi to each other, also the relations of different styles and different types of music that he uses, you know, whether it's a really solemn brass chorale or a majestic tutti for the whole orchestra, or a really kind of demonic, scary passage. You've got to try and pace those moments so that when you arrive at the big climax, there's a sense of inevitability to it. And I think it's like going on a long hike through the mountains. Sometimes to pace it right, you got to do it a few times. You know, you sort of get it wrong the first few times you have a crack at these massive pieces. Because yeah, a conductor has to get these pieces in their body to a certain sense and find where the weight of it is, where the weight of sound is, and where the thematic material has this sense of drive, or where you sense that it needs to have some repose. And I think the lovely thing about it is that there's no one perfect way of doing it. You listen to Claudio Bardo conduct the first movement of Mahler 2, and it's very different to the way Simon Rattle conducts the first movement of Mahler 2. Both of them are compelling, you know, and both conductors have conducted that symphony a lot, and they've arrived at their decisions after a lot of deliberation. And, you know, I kind of think that the music can sort of tolerate those different and contrasting interpretations.
Isn't that exciting, Simon, that 120 years after the piece was written, or longer, that we're still having these conversations about these pieces of music, and anyone who thinks that classical, and I listen to the QAS and QAO2, and anyone who says that classical music doesn't have a future or is dying is just so wrong, because we're having this conversation about how important it is to have to play Mahler symphonies, and all of that, what you just said about Abbado and Rattle, it's so alive. That was a fantastic answer, Simon, and also that whole idea that it's in Mahler, it's also about the moment to moment, rather than, with the Brahms, the structure is, I mean, I've never conducted a Mahler symphony and probably never will, but is it also the moment is really much more important than, say, the moments in Brahms, which is much more structurally realistic? I'm not sure.
No, I think that's right, but I think it's also different from piece to piece with Mahler. Say, the last movement of Mahler 3 is a very different movement to the first movement of Mahler 2. With the first movement of Mahler 2, it is almost, he jolts you in different directions, where suddenly, kind of, when you're in the repetition of the exposition, he suddenly changes the tempo. And Più Mosso, and you've got similar material, but it's much faster. How much faster? And so, yes, it's more moment to moment and more jarring, whereas there are other Mahlerian movements that are more unified and more that sense of sort of an unfolding of structure. So, and Das Lied von der Erde is another, we don't have time to go into all the details of it, but the last movement of that is half an hour long. Some of the most difficult music to conduct that exists. It's all in this very loose one, in 3/4, but with incredibly virtuosic little intricate lines for the strings that need to be directed, but they need to fold into each other. It's a huge challenge, but when it works, boy, it's fun, because it feels like you've got a spider's web in your hands, and you can sort of stretch it here and there and just make it so.
Simon, can I ask you a question as a conductor?
Yeah.
When you said that Abbado and Rattle have basically thought and performed Mahler so often, and basically they have their own interpretations, how much do you think that they are influenced by the individual players that they are given in a symphony, in any particular symphony orchestra? How much do you think that influences their interpretation? And do you think that changes depending on the orchestra that they're working with?
Yeah, I think so. Like, one of the fascinating things, if you have the opportunity to conduct orchestras in different countries, is how different orchestras can be. A North German orchestra is different to a South German orchestra, which is different to an Austrian orchestra. Italian orchestras respond differently again. French orchestras have a different way of playing. So you have these national traditions that still exist now. If you conduct Mahler with a French orchestra, you have to talk about very different things to if you conduct, I don't know, Debussy with a German orchestra, because the players come to it very differently. And I think a lot of that is influenced by training, but also culture and language. The same way that the Germans like dark bread and the French like their fluffy baguettes. There's something in the language, in the culture, that sort of directs them to play in a certain way. And of course, then you have individual musicians in the orchestra who have a profound impact sometimes on the choices that you make. If you listen to a wind soloist who's doing something absolutely gorgeous, it might be different to what you had intended or wanted, but you'd be an idiot to sort of ride roughshod over that. You kind of want to take that, and only if you think you can't quite make that work with what you then want to do with the strings might you have a chat to them about it. But I think, yeah, your experience of these works is different from orchestra to orchestra, and depends also on your encounter with the individual musicians in the orchestra. I might move on to the next question, because we've got a few questions piling up here. Sam Knock has a question. For Paul specifically as a composer, but also as a performer for both Paul and Trish, what do you think of the completions of Mahler 10? And what are your philosophies on completions of works left unfinished, like Bruckner 9? It's a big one.
That's huge.
You can leave Bruckner 9 alone. It's perfect as it is. Yeah, it's complicated, isn't it? I think the Derek Cook version of Mahler 10 is about as good as it could possibly get. Um, I I think it's really interesting to imagine where he was going with that symphony. I think Mahler 10's a bit different because it was such a pivotal change in his language as well, and it was even more harrowing than the Ninth Symphony. So I think for all of us to have, you know, what, there's 5, 6 versions of Mahler 10 now. I think it's been absolutely fascinating to just be given that chance to imagine where that symphony was going, and but always understanding that it's not really his work. It's the first movement is his work, and that stands alone in my mind as one of the great movements of orchestral music in any case. The finishing version of Elgar 3 is really unsuccessful as far as I'm concerned. The finishing of Beethoven 10, you can forget about. Bruckner 9 should be left alone. Schubert unfinished should also be left alone. But that's my incredibly humble, obviously, opinion. I think it gives us a great insight to where perhaps these pieces were going. But as long as we always remember that Mahler 10, yeah.
I think it's important to remember that Derek Cook, you know, he called his completion a performing version. All he wanted to do was make the sketches audible so that we could get a sense. He never intended it, I think, to be as successful a completion as it subsequently proved to have been. And now people hear it and think, oh, that's what Mahler's 10th would have sounded like. Whereas Derek Cook never had that ambition, nor that ego. He just sort of,
that's the important thing. He didn't bring ego to the, you know, because if I was given, you know, Mahler 10 to finish, you know, I would have brought in, you know, I would have brought the kitchen sink into it, you know, the ego would have been there from the get-go. But I love the fact that he sort of did it academically, but a passion version of academically. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
That's the thing with any of these completions. It's kind of like, you know, you're being given some Vegemite on toast, and then suddenly somebody swaps it for Marmite. It's just not the same experience at all, is it? It's just things, you can feel the emotion drops out of it. The same emotional content drops out of it, and you can analyze it to death, but somehow they lose the soul of it in these completions. For me, anyway.
It's no longer the composer. I mean, the same is true of Turandot, you know, which Puccini, of course, never finished. And there is an ending, and it's almost always performed, but you hear straight away that's where
nobody could orchestrate like Puccini.
No. Okay, I got another question from Ruben in QAO2. He says, "Hey Paul, are we going to play your symphony in QAO2?"
Yes, go for it.
Thank you, Ruben. I can see you sitting there.
Can I just say, hey, Ruben, it's really, really hard. But anyway, go on.
I don't think it's a piece that I will be able to conduct personally. And you know what? We've got so much better music than my symphony to play in QAO2 before we get there. And by the time we get to my symphony with QAO2, you'll be principal viola of the Berlin Philharmonic. So
you're playing it there.
You can play it there, mate.
It is one of the most rhythmically complex pieces I've ever played. We all, like in the AWO, we all practiced our parts for 3 weeks solid before we came together. And then it was still really difficult. It's hard. It's really hard. He won't do that in future because I sort of bound and gagged him and beat him up in a corner.
That's good to know. I got a question from Oscar. I got a question from Oscar. I think we got time for let's go until 11:15, hey, and then I'll let you all get on with your.
Does anyone know the numbers for Queensland today? That's a big question.
No, I haven't looked. All right, I'm going to keep our minds on. This is far more fun talking about symphonies. So this is from Oscar Schmidt, Principal Horn of QAS, addressed to all of us. What are our thoughts on the current orchestra programming where you start with the overture, have a soloist, and then play your big work symphony? In the early 1900s, they'd split up the symphony and play it throughout the entire concert, or have it in the middle and finish with the overture. What do you think are the advantages or disadvantages of either option, at least in early 20th century Europe?
Depends on the pieces. I always found it odd that the first half would finish with the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. I think it's a great, the most amazing, or the Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto is a great finish to a concert. Conversely, I think Brahms 3, one of my favorite symphonies, but also doesn't finish, it always gets a lukewarm reception because it sort of finishes piano or mezzo forte. Sibelius 4, historically the most famous symphony for finishing mezzo forte. It depends on the piece, and I think we need to think in a modern context about how programs work. But I don't think it works for everything. I think being, a smarty pants and playing Tchaik 6 and playing a different piece in between each movement, which people do from time to time in various different forms. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I think to divide a symphony up is kind of goes back to that first question of what is a symphony. And I think it's a great statement. Maybe I'm a traditionalist and a conservative. I'm sorry for that.
Can I say that as somebody who's played thousands of orchestral concerts, I like the traditional format. I really do, because I think you have the warm up with the overture. This is only from a player's perspective, though. You have the warm up with the overture. It's usually something fast and frivolous, and or it's what we call a T10, token 10, and then you have the opportunity for soloists. We have to keep soloists alive. They're a rare beast, and they need to go and wow the audience. And then you have the interval, and then that the special moment is coming up where the audience is actually going to listen to the orchestra, and we're not a backing group, and we're not playing silly stuff. We're playing the story. Now, if you then turn around, and I love mixing up programs, don't get me wrong. I love doing things where we have segue programs with all kinds of things mixed in chamber music, over an hour and a half with no clapping, or, having two things being played at once, that kind of thing. So I'm not traditionalist in that regard. But in terms of a symphony, I think most symphonies are a journey, and it's like reading a book. Do you really want, or it's kind of like watching a film on the ABC, do you really want the ads to come in? You kind of don't. Or do you want to start reading another book in the middle of it? Or would you like to go on the journey that the composer actually wrote for you? Do we have an hour of our lives or 40 minutes of our lives to give to that composer and experience it the way that he intended it or she intended it to be? And I think that that's something that needs to be, in some way, where we spend so much time mucking around with programs, and we are just as guilty of it. But I think we need to also realize that book or that symphony has been written to be experienced in one uninterrupted hit with no ads or short stories in the middle of it.
Yeah, okay. I've got a question two questions from the Daniels. First of all, from Hugh Daniel. I notice your CD collection. I think he's talking to me. It's my CD collection, part of it.
Ours is there too.
Should we be listening to Mahler on CD or streaming? Do you think CDs are dead, or should I be buying up all the CDs in the op shops for $1 each? Thanks.
Can I answer that?
Go ahead, Paul.
Oh, for goodness sake, we've got to stop this obsession with streaming. A, the sound quality is generally terrible on Spotify, so that's the first thing. B, the musicians now are starving to death thanks to COVID, and let's continue that starving to death by listening to everything on Spotify and not buying their CDs.
We get nothing.
10,000 hits on Spotify equals 19 cents to the artist. I mean, come on. It's absolutely disgusting. But the sound is terrible too. I mean, you can get really high quality streaming, of course.
Not on Spotify.
But that makes a difference. Our audio nerd friends, they have these special downloads where they get, better than CD quality and all of that. Hardly anyone does that. But records, CDs.
You get a record player and a record.
Yeah, and
That's the best.
Support the artists. Yeah, performing arts throughout the world, pop, rock, jazz, classical, traditional, world music. Everyone's starving to death at the moment. So support them. Get onto a CD shop online and just buy a whole stack of CDs.
Apart from that, when the CD is produced, there's a booklet produced that you never see on Spotify. You don't see any of the artwork or any of the words that people have written to support that production. It's a production as a whole. and it starts from the recording, and it includes the cover and the images and the biographies and the reason for being in the introduction to the recording. So that's just as important, and you miss out on all of that on Spotify.
I also add something Paul said at the start of this conversation about he liked just the ritual of putting the LP on the turntable, and there's an element of that to the CD as well, getting the CD out of the case and putting in its thing. One thing that, although I do enjoy watching performances on YouTube, there's live performances. When I was growing up, I was fascinated by live orchestral performance and conductors, and you just couldn't see them in Brisbane. You know, now you can go online and see all sorts of famous orchestras and famous performances, and I love that, and that's a great resource.
Yeah.
But what I don't enjoy is just how you can, if you're not enjoying it, you can more or less swipe right. You know, you can just kind of skip that one and go to something else. Whereas I remember when I was a kid, if you put a CD on, I listened to the CD, and it was harder to jump from your favorite moment of this to your favorite moment of that. And so you necessarily had to have a more engaged interaction with what you were listening to. You put the CD on, you sat and you listened, and you couldn't sort of, you know, have that attention deficit disorder kind of thing where you sort of say, oh, 15 seconds of that, I'm bored, I'm going to listen to something else. And I think that's really important, actually, to develop that concentration required to engage with an hour-long span of music. You know, you have to sort of invest a little bit of time and effort.
Yeah,
it's a commitment.
Yeah, and I think exactly, Simon, you really hit a point. And I think the members of the youth orchestras are in a really great position that they understand that music develops over 40 minutes or an hour, or in Mahler's case, you know, however many hours. It develops over this large space and time, which a lot of people in the generation of our youth orchestra members don't experience in any facet of their life. So I think that's a really important thing too. Yeah.
I think that's a really great place to leave it for today, everybody. Thanks so much for, you know, committing an hour and 20 minutes of your Saturday morning to talking about music. Thank you, Paul and Trish, for all your thoughtful answers, and also for taking the time to talk to us all. Let's wait and see what they do with lockdown. Hopefully we'll be back rehearsing next Saturday. I'm looking forward to seeing and hearing you all back at the old museum. Take care of yourselves, and yeah, use lockdown well, practice lots. Okay,
and listen to lots of big long symphonies.
That's a great idea. All right, everybody, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
See you.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Still can't do it.